Welcome friends once again to the NPTEL module on strategic trade and protectionism theories and empirics. We have largely discussed many theories on identifying strategies for international trade. So, largely those vary from classical to new classical approach, and those are based on various facts and figures, and this is our our 28th lecture, and we have already arrived into the section called tariffs, or the most important aspects of protectionism. So, this is week number 6, and myself Dr. Pratap Mohanty have been covering these protection issues in various training centers, especially for the Indian revenue servants for their training, and largely the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers are discussed. And in this context, let us understand, since the last class we discussed types of barriers, types of protectionism, where we identified tariffs. So, now we are trying to find out what are the effects, what kind of effects. I mean today, in these two lectures we are emphasizing on the kind of effects or the kind of protection we are going to deal with. Especially the extent of effect, the magnitude of effect is very important to ponder on. So, therefore, the title of that chapter, the title of the presentation today is specified as welfare effects of tariff. So, what are exactly being covered or going to be covered are identify again protectionism, partial equilibrium analysis of tariff. This is the one we have also referred in our earlier lectures to some extent, especially identifying the effect on small country versus large country debates, while we understood for offer curve analysis. Now, besides that, we are also supposed to know the partial is against general equilibrium analysis of tariff. Then small country and large country debates must have been also understood for a better clarity. And at the end of the two lectures, we will for sure will be trying our best to clarify optimum tariff. In between, there are other points like effective rate of protection. Just protection is not enough. So, there are other kind of protection which are very important, and in practice many countries have been doing so. So, let us move on. The complete framework of the analysis, which we have already shown this. And so, tariff here are discussed in the context of small country and in large country setups. So, small country and large country, and we will be identifying through a general equilibrium perspective, where all the markets are simultaneously dealt, and the distribution of the income and how it impacts the determination of optimum tariff is very important. So, tariff types are discussed, ad valorem, specific and compound, and here in the partial equilibrium setup also, partial equilibrium setup as well, we will try to identify through the very structure of demand and supply diagram. So, we will identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue, or overall welfare to the country. So, broadly we will identify welfare analysis and efficiency of certain segments in the country, especially for the consumers as well as the producers. So, let me tune into the exact portion of the content. Now, so as we have already understood that less the restriction, and it is good for the country, even if this is prescribed in many theory, but largely many countries have been in practice restricting the flows of other goods. Now, and it has also been observed that the restriction is actually beneficial to the participating countries, and they derive large extent of number of strategies to maximize their individual gain. Now, had it been the fact that all the members countries are simultaneously cooperating and they derive the best out of it, the total welfare to each of the member country could have been much higher as mentioned in the theory. So, now who has the responsibility? The Government of India's Foreign Trade Act and India's export import policy govern the import related tariffs. So, therefore, FTP policy, foreign trade policy, the latest document as we discussed into the draft report is available for the 1520, which prescribe number of tariff lines. So, the DGFT of India, which is DGFT Director General of Foreign Trade, mandates registration of all the importers before engaging in import and export activities. Now, as we already said, FTP stands for foreign trade policy, which is usually made for in every 5 years time and reviewed annually, and that was the responsibility of the Department of Commerce. Now, there are what it does basically in identifying market and product diversification, and these are usually the twin pillars of WTO discussion as well as the foreign trade policy. So, tariff, it has been also observed that tariff have been sharply reduced since World War II, and because of many suggestions through GATT or any other topmost financial organization, institutional framework which has actually reduced the tariff lines. Now, let us understand the effects of tariff. The previous some of the points we have already discussed in early lectures, so let us not emphasize so much. Coming to the effects of tariff, broadly we will talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus. In consumer surplus, we mean how the tariff, imposition of tariff is actually creating some kind of extra pay or the burden on the consumers, and how the consumer are actually receiving the burden, and those can be measured with the demand curve. And whereas producer surplus received through the excess minimum, basically it is defined as the producer in excess of the minimum price at which they are willing to produce. Usually this is defined as what the consumer, in case of consumer surplus, we usually define what the consumer sum of marginal utility of the consumers derives from ivories from 1 to nth commodities minus the exact payment the consumer is actually paying to the ith commodity. So, this is nothing but called consumer surplus. Now, similarly we can define for producer surplus. Basically this says in consumer surplus says the total utility minus total spending. So, the net is actually called consumer surplus. Similarly, in the producer surplus, what the producers are receiving minus the exact or the real cost of production or the opportunity cost of production. So, basically producer surplus measures the net gain out of trade. Now, here the context is for tariff, how tariff actually changes consumer surplus as well as producer surplus is the trivial aspect of understanding, we must emphasize it. Now, import, so there are different types of tariff as we discussed in the last class. Largely import versus and export tariffs are compared. Usually you do not, countries hardly charge any tariffs, impose any tariff on exports because it demotivates exports, whereas country usually impose tariff on the imported products. So, so this is what we have said. So, there are broadly different types of tariff. First category is ad valorem. It is basically the proportionate change in the value of the product and the the tax amount increases or decreases. Second one is specific, no matter what is the value we are importing, there will be a specific sum amount imposed. but the important direction in this regard is the compound tariff, where many of the tariff lines are actually channelized this through compound interest, where it is composed of fixed as well as ad valorem. So, there are different kind of structures given in tariff. So, those three are broadly discussed in different theories of tariffs. So, as we discussed in the last class, tariff is a tax on the obviously on the imported goods. Now, on an ad valorem basis, as we just said, or on a fixed or ad valorem, or this is also called per unit basis. So, an extra tax on the top of the regular tariff is called surcharge or called import surcharge. Now, what are the effects of a tariff on price, output and consumption? We let us have certain assumptions to evaluate it, otherwise it's completely meaningless to talk about the impacts. So, the first assumption is there is only one price for a good, then only we can talk about imposition of tariff by a country and its impact on the world prices. But if the price is different, then tariff probably is not going to be evaluated. So, foreign producers are willing to supply us with all the units of the goods we want at that price. Now, this is an assumption, because if the foreign producers are reluctant to export the product at a given price, so the exact impact of tariff imposition probably is not understood or evaluated. So, therefore, this is very important. Now, we also assume that the government imposes tariff amount T, let it be T, and importers will still able to buy the goods from foreign producers, that is at a price PW, and they will have to PW, as I just said, they will have to pay the import tax of amount T, let it be, this is defined in T. So, the new price after taxes by the government, the new price boils down to be PW plus T, that is equal to PT. So, PT stands for the price after tariff. So, consumption, I mean basically this is on consumption of imported goods subsequently decreases, consumption decreases. Why? Because the price T is greater than that of P or PW. So, since the after price is higher, after tariff the price is higher, the consumption of those goods actually falls. So, to add further to our discussion, the domestic production of the goods increases as domestic firms are able to charge a higher price, while remaining are competitive vis-a-vis foreign firms. So, finally, imported goods actually decrease, as we just said. Now, based on this understanding, we may move into the discussion of resource allocation, how resources are actually allocated due to tariff. So, besides the rise in prices, there has been a fall in imports and due to the tariff influence. So, now how it affects allocation, because of the fact that inputs in domestic production is getting changed. So, there is an increase in the domestic production, I mean to increase the domestic production, which requires additional resource like land, labor, capital to be reallocated from prior uses. So, basically here we wanted to emphasize the allocation effects, since the domestic cost of production increased after tariff on certain segment. So, the domestic reallocation takes place. If labor land is expensive or land related products are expensive, then land may be used little less. So, those reallocations also evaluated in terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus, we will evaluate in our diagram. So, what are the economic effects of tariff? As we already discussed, if tariff tariff is imposed, supply is retarded, supply is disturbed. So, supply curve is actually shifted towards back, it is disincentivized. So, it is shifted towards back, which resulted in higher prices. Price will rise and quantity demanded will fall. In a simple partial equilibrium setup, can easily be understood. Okay, so, amount of quantity import will decrease. Now, amount of tariff will be simply the extent of quantity tariff, I mean that amount of Q imported times the T. So, it is nothing but tariff rate times the quantity imported. So, now this much is imported times T. So, this highlighted area is nothing but the revenue earned by the government if the tax is imposed by the government. So, in the partial equilibrium setups, as I just said, through the demand and supply analysis which only captures very limited information. So, there are broadly 4 effects we are going to discuss. First is called consumption effect, where tariff usually reduce domestic consumption. There are production effect, which is which indeed fosters domestic production due to higher relative prices. So, there are trade effects as well, and trade effects where the decline in imports is observed, revenue effects where the extent of imports times the price. So, government earns revenue out of it. We will also try to compare this in our next lecture. Next lecture we will be discussing about I mean the revenue effect of this as against non-tariff barriers. Those will be very interesting to observe. So, now what are the resulting effect we have partly discussed earlier. So, more the elastic the demand curve is, we will observe through the diagram in a short while. More the elastic. Now, imagine the demand curve is more flatter. Now, more elastic the demand curve. What do you mean by this? It is very responsive to the to the change in the prices. Now, since tariff is increasing the price level, the consumption effect will be very stronger. So, what is going to happen? The revenue effect might fall, because it is not going to purchase I mean import will be restricted hugely. Okay. So, greater the consumption effect as I just said. So, more the elastic the supply curve. Supply is more responsive, that means higher the tariff, higher the supply, the greater is the production effect. So, those effects can be understood with the help of detailed diagrammatic analysis. More elastic the demand curve and domestic supply curve, when both are elastic, greater the trade effect. So, jointly the trade effect will be more and smaller is the revenue effect, because both are very highly responsive. So, that will restrict the trade. So, revenue will be eventually reduced. We will analyze that. So, resulting effect of tariff in terms of consumer surplus and producer surplus can be evaluated. So, as I just said, under the demand curve, I mean if you just draw a simple consumers surplus diagram from the microeconomics theory, under the demand curve is basically all the utilities derived by the consumers. So, given a price, if a price is set somewhere here due to market equilibrium or so. So, if this is the supply curve, a price is determined, so this much of quantity is produced. Now, consumers are supposed to pay this much of price to this much of income to the seller. So, consumers are not saving anything out of it. So, the total utility are expressed under the demand curve till this quantity. Now, this much is paid out of the total utility. So, what is left? So, this much is left. So, these are actually this triangle is actually representing consumer surplus. So, we have understood earlier in microeconomics theory. So, this is simply a microeconomic analysis, whereas the producer surplus it is simply the total revenue earned minus the total expenditure made to earn those revenue. So, basically the producers, this is the P, this is the Q. So, the producers earns this much of revenue after selling this much of quantity as demanded by the consumers. So, based on that how much is the spending, these are the spending for each unit of production till this quantity. So, total revenue is that. So, whatever is left, these are actually producer surplus PS. Okay. So, increase the producer surplus and rent is the payment that need to be made in the long run to induce a domestic producer to supply additional goods with the tariff. So, those may be utilized for subsidies purposes to understand the effect of subsidy. Now, so resulting effect of tariff redistribution of income. So, as we discussed, domestic consumers to domestic producers due to higher prices, and from nation's abundant factors to nation's scarce factor, as we discussed in earlier theories, because the abundant factors are usually producing higher prices, I mean usually exporting their products, whereas by exporting the products, and in return we usually take import of the scarce factors which are usually imported. Now, due to tariff is going to protect those industries. So, their prices for those imported items where the scarce factors are used will be receiving higher prices after tariff. So, therefore, scarce there will be redistribution of income. So, tariff really helps in identifying those things. So, this leads to inefficiencies or protection cost. So, there are those can be explained with the help of deadweight losses in the diagram. Okay, so, what do we we have already explained this is if price increases, then the total area is consumer surplus. Now, the net area this much is consumer surplus. So, this is the loss of consumer surplus so far consumer surplus is concerned, and this is the revenue. Now, at price 1, now at the new price 2, revenue is now increased. So, net gain in revenue is I mean these are under these are actually cost of production. So, the highlighted area is called net revenue to the producer, these are called producer surplus PS. This is I mean gain of positive PS and CS which is negative. Okay. So, this is clearly identified with the diagram. Now, given the explanation as we just made, the theory as we talked about, now if the price is 1 and 100% tariff is imposed on that. So, now if it is 1 rupees is added, so now price is actually T plus P plus T, P plus T which is equal to 2. So, now due to rise in the price, so now initial level of consumer surplus are like this whole area under the curve, and now due to higher prices this is the consumers of small triangle. So, these are the whole area of loss of consumer surplus, whereas producers gain by this area trapezium area, and the deadweight loss can be easily explained out this area. This is the bigger trapezium area is JCBH is the loss of consumer surplus after deducting producer surplus, but there will be gain the area. So, I mean again I will just talk about. Now, due to this higher tariff, what is going to happen? Producers are actually gaining. So, there are some production effect. So, I mean producers are going to produce domestically, they produced 10 units earlier, due to higher prices, rise in prices, now they are producing 20. So, 10 to 20 is basically called production effect, whereas consumption effect like initially consumer are consuming 70 units, now due to tariff, so the new consumption is 70. So, 70 minus 50 minus 20 is the consumption effect. So, basically there is a loss, I mean basically there is less consumption. Now, consumers, if a consumer surplus and producer surplus can also be derived. So, producer surplus is nothing but A, C, J, G, area A, C, J, G as we have already discussed, whereas consumer surplus is the area with J, C, B, H. Now, out of all those things, how much is now imported? 20 units are actually produced by the domestic producers, but 50 units are now still imported. So, the net import is again 50 minus 20, this is basically 30. 30 units times the tax is paid 1. So, 30 into 1 equal to $30 or 30 rupees, whatever the denominations can be identified. So, this is largely the revenue effect, J revenue effect, explained as JMNH. So, so net loss to the society is this area, this is highlighted here, this one and this one, net losses to the society after after imposition of tariff. Now, now what is more important in the discussion for us is to identify the redistribution of income, as well as to talk about some kind of net losses to the society as explained by deadweight loss. So, the JCM minus of this minus of H and B is called deadweight loss, DW, deadweight loss to the society so far as efficiency measures are concerned. Now, what are the effects are again explained here, we can find out from this diagram as well, effects of tariff on net welfare losses. So, we have already seen B and D, it must have retained deadweight loss, consumption loss, deadweight loss only consumption is D, deadweight loss of consumption is D, because this much of consumption is forgone due to tariff, because only Q2 is consumed in our last diagram already discussed. Here only 50 is consumed now. So, this is the loss, D is the area loss due to consumption effect, and this much is extra gain to the producers. So, B is the area defined as the gain to the producers, or what we wanted to say is the following. So, the gain actually to the producers are G and A, and so the total losses are broadly divided into B, and here it is D, B minus D. So, these two are jointly defined as called deadweight loss. Now, government revenue you can find out in the pre-tariff position as compared to post-tariff position. C is the area called government revenue. So, these are the way by which you can define the welfare changes to the society, as we have already defined 30 as here. This is 10 because it is so times 1, this is the one area defined like this, this is the area defined here. So, as per the examples given in the book, you can refer the book by Dominic Salvatore, you can clarify the exact figures from the book. Now, let us understand certain other potential cost of tariff, since you are emphasizing the welfare effects of tariff. The tariff have effects that are less predictable and harder to quantify. Largely retaliation by other countries as to the net loss of a tariff, because if one country impose tariff, another country will retaliate by hurting export markets of other industries. So, therefore, the tariff rates are highly expected to be escalating. So, innovation related impacts are there. Tariff reduce competitive pressures, because we restrict the movements. So, domestic firms and their incentives to innovate actually hampers. So, there are rent seeking behavior observed. Rent seeking basically it uses any activity that uses in order to capture more income without actually producing a good or survive or to survive. So, so firm hire lobbyists to maintain tariff protection. Usually they hire lobby strategists to maintain their tariff protection, even if they do not produce, they earn income out of it. So, there are lots of political gain attached to it. Political systems that do not easily provide tariffs are more likely to avoid rents seeking behavior. Now, so let us compare with some tariff rates over the time. Since the mid 90s, tariff rates in most countries have been fallen. We have also discussed since Second World War there has been fall in the tariff rates. Tariff rates in developing countries are relatively higher than that of developed countries because of the fact that they need to protect their market. Developed nations often have highest tariffs in agriculture, textiles and other labor intensive products, and the very products of developing nations would like to exports. So, basically developed country restrict the products which developed countries wishes to export to them. So, now if you check from the book different book, you will find certain tariff lines over the time there have been constant fall. Now, this is the triangle line is for low income countries, this is high income countries, this is the lower one, this is the higher income countries over that period, and this middle one is called middle income countries, the tariff lines, average tariff line, low income countries. So, on the average low income countries has higher tariff lines than as compared to the high income countries. Now, another check to understand the tariff structure in industrial countries. So, basically pre Doha Uruguay round, there are Uruguay round in Uruguay there are WTO negotiations. In the pre Uruguay round the tariff lines are higher as compared to the post Uruguay round, there have been fall as compared to this has been fall in the tariff line in every category for raw materials, semi manufacturing products and finished products. So, in order to understand the tariff structure, we need to refer to various rounds of WTO, and the implications are actually varying based on the bound rates imposed by tariffs. So, especially in Uruguay round there have been many binding contracts agreed by the member countries. We will actually discuss we will discuss tariff and WTO and its role, India and tariff in the next class in detail. I think this will be our next discussion, where we will also emphasizing the complete effective rate of protection in detail. So, with this I think I should stop here, we will carry forward. Thank you.